Hey everyone, first can you all hear me? Is that alright? I'm pretty terrible with hearing my own voice, so I don't know how loud I'm being. So if you can't hear me, put your hand up. I don't know how you're going to hear that you can't hear me, but there you go. So that's my face, but when I have a beard and with different glasses. I want to talk to you about Blazor. Anybody here used Blazor before? Nobody? Anybody know anything about Blazor? Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. Anybody know anything about Blazor? Yeah, okay, cool. Anybody awake? Yeah, brilliant, excellent. Okay, so yeah, I create a podcast called the .NET Core Podcast. That's my Twitter, .NET Core Show. DMs are open, so if you ever want to talk to me about anything, just send me a message, I don't mind. This entire presentation slide deck thing that I'm doing is a Node app, so I'll send out the link to the source code for these. But pull the source code and do an npm run, and then remember to hit S. You get all these cool slide notes and stuff, which I'm going to be reading on this screen because I can't be bothered to keep wandering backwards and forwards. So the last time that I did this, I did it in 2 parts, and then someone came up to me afterwards and said, you put too much history in it. So the first part is all about how we got from no CSS and JavaScript up to having ridiculous amounts of CSS and JavaScript, so I'm going to skip over that. But before we get to that, and do a little bit of self-promotion because that's what I'm all about. As I said, I do the .NET Core podcast, the .NET Core.show. I do a show with my brother called Waffling Tailors. I do another couple of shows with some American friends of mine. I've started this one here, J&J Media. I've started a little sort of side business with my friend Jay Miller, who does the Productivity and Tech podcast, all about getting people started with doing podcasts if you're at all interested in that, because it kind of gets difficult to do. I am a contract .NET developer, so that's my company there, RJJ Software, and apparently I can't spell podcast. If you want to learn a little bit about the show, go join the newsletter if you want, or just send me a Twitter thing. I don't mind. I am going to be borrowing from a lot of sources for this. A lot of the sources you're not going to see, but the big ones for the .NET stuff, for the Blazor stuff, is these guys here. If you do pull the code and run it on your machine, like I said, make sure to hit S, because there's a whole bunch of links here. You just literally click the link and it'll take over the tab, so that's pretty nice. But yeah, so definitely check these out, and remember to hit that S key when you're running to get these slide notes. What I'm going to do is I'm literally going to skip over all of this. In fact, I'll show you the Space Jam image just because that entire site's in HTML. It still exists. We can't blame Brandon Ike. Skip all of that. So jump straight to JavaScript in space, because what could go wrong with putting JavaScript on a satellite, right? Nothing. For those of you who haven't done Array 16, join WAT-1 plus Batman in a browser. I would recommend it because you get Batman, which is pretty cool. Can you imagine if a satellite hits your house and wipes your entire house out, and they go, sorry, we forgot to do triple equals instead of double equals? Totally going to happen, right? So yeah, so then at some point we decided we want type safety in our JavaScript. So then we said CoffeeScript, LiveScript, TypeScript. The last two are joke ones. They are JavaScript libraries, but they're not type safety at all. Arnold.js lets you type up stuff in Arnie quotes, and Trump.js is all about making JavaScript great again. Then along came the single page applications, and you end up with hundreds of megabytes in the no, you don't. You're not supposed to end up with hundreds of megabytes in the browser. If you do it wrong, you end up with hundreds of megabytes in the browser. As at least someone in here knows someone that I used to work with that managed to create hundreds of megabytes of JavaScript in the browser. But yeah, you end up with lots of JavaScript you have to download, and then it has to be parsed, and then it has to be compiled, because it is a compiled language, but it's not, but it is. And then, SPA frameworks promised us that we wouldn't have to use JavaScript by making us use JavaScript, which is really annoying. And then, so we've gone through, so imagine I've just talked to you about how great being able to use CSS and JavaScript is, right? And then what about being able to use .NET in the browser? Anybody remember SilverLight? Yeah, okay. Anybody still using SilverLight? No? Okay, cool. For those who don't know, SilverLight was a way of running .NET in your browser, but you had to, every time someone used your website, they had to install a plugin to be able to run the code in the browser, which was no good. Which was why Chris Dunelm came up with the idea of .NET Anywhere. He saw that the browser was becoming sort of like a universal runtime. So why can't we use .NET inside the browser? And it kind of worked for a little while, except that to get it working, you had to cross-compile the .NET code, which had been, they called it at the time reference source. So it wasn't open source and it wasn't closed source. If you were partners with Microsoft, you could get the source, and if you weren't partners with Microsoft, you got the reference source, which is essentially a little bit more detailed than the documentation we usually get as developers. And the idea was you would cross-compile it into WebAssembly. So you saw a slide earlier on this evening about there being a lightning talk on WebAssembly next month. I would recommend coming to that if you're at all interested in Blazor, because Blazor uses WebAssembly. I can kind of go into a little bit of WebAssembly, but I'm not a WebAssembly expert. So yeah, the problem with .NET Anywhere was it was incredibly limited. So .NET has always been a very thin wrapper around the Windows 32 APIs. You want to draw a form, it will do W handle and create all the pointers for you and do all of that crazy C stuff to make that work. But the problem was that you don't have that inside the browser, so then you have to not compile that bit, and then, okay, so all of these bits that require the Windows 32 APIs aren't there. What are you going to do? So it essentially went nowhere for 6 years until Steve Sanderson, creator of Knockout.js. Anybody use Knockout.js? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, he created Knockout.js, and that's not a real quote, by the way, that's just something I came up with. It's actually a rip-off of a lyric from Mr. B. But yeah, he saw .NET Anywhere and thought this could go somewhere, we could do something with this. He took his knowledge of creating JavaScript frameworks, and he'd recently been hired by the ASP.NET Core team to create their SPA frameworks library. So you can do in the console, you could do .NET New, I think it's SPA, or Angular and stuff like that, and it will bootstrap an entire Angular app wrapped up in .NET Core, which is pretty cool. So he decided, I'm going to take a look at this, see what I can do. Meanwhile, Xamarin was being bought by Microsoft. So Xamarin, for those who don't know, anybody used Xamarin? Yep. Yeah, okay. So Xamarin is a wonderful, wonderful system for creating cross-platform mobile apps. It's recently been expanded to cover sort of desktop-y things, which is wonderful. But it's based on this .NET runtime called Mono, which was a black box re-implementation of it. So they took the documentation that was available, didn't look at any of the source code, and thought, how would we implement this in C cross-platform? So because it didn't require the Windows 32 APIs, it was pretty small, really tight, ran really well. It also powers the Unity 3D game engine. So anybody play video games? Yeah, you've probably played something that uses Xamarin. If you write video games and you use Unity, you've used Xamarin. So why not take this really small cross-platform .NET runtime and cross-compile it to WebAssembly? So I guess, what is WebAssembly? So so in my notes here, I've got a huge paragraph. So the same weekend that I was down in Hack 24 for the first time, which is like 3-4 years ago. Obviously you may not have been there, but that's how I remember it. I was busy losing at Hack 24 whilst WebAssembly was being finally ratified and released. So WebAssembly is essentially a walled garden, in effect, that allows you to throw a binary at it, and it will run kind of inside a JavaScript runtime, and it will allow you to run whatever binaries you throw at it, as long as they're in WebAssembly format. Most programming languages can be cross-compiled into WebAssembly. I guess this is the boring bit, but yeah, you can do Dart, you can do Go, you can do OCaml, you can do Smalltalk, whatever you want. You can cross-compile it into WebAssembly and load it in the browser, which is, I guess, a good thing. Depends on how you feel about loading things into the browser. So yeah, so then they took Mono and cross-compiled it and started removing things, because why would you want to be able to do TCP? You can't do TCP in JavaScript, so why would you want to do that in the browser? I've got a part 2 bit there, because usually all of that and about 12,000 other slides before it are part 1. But what is Blazor? So yeah, imagine if you could do interactive UI stuff in the browser without having to use JavaScript. You still have to use JavaScript, but it's all abstracted away from you. imagine if you could run .NET in the browser, right? This wonderful idea of being able to do this strongly typed, static yet slightly dynamic language that is functional but also procedural in your browser that is not JavaScript. And that's kind of what Blazor is. Imagine being able to do all of your rendering of the DOM on the server and just pull through a tiny little bit that represents what's happening on screen. So I could have a button here that doesn't do anything until I push the button. It goes and processes something on the server, and then a new page appears. Sounds really stupid, but it's actually quite good. And obviously, Blazor is browser and Razor, just putting that Razor stuff in the browser. I don't know why the two R's make an L, but you know, maybe they were feeling particularly racist or something that day. I don't know. I've put together a small sort of timeline of stuff, so you can see in 2010, .NET Anywhere was initially committed. You got WebAssembly in 2017. At some point, Steve Sanderson discovers it. Steve Sanderson then goes, right, I'm going to fork this and start making something else. Around about that time, ASP.NET Core, the entire team got together and just sat in a big tent at the Microsoft campus in Seattle. Huge tent, Microsoft's campus in Seattle, and just all sat there and tried to come up with new things that you could do in the browser. Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could do system.random? Okay, let's do system.random. Wouldn't it be cool if we could draw individual pixels? Let's go do that. And then June 2017, whilst they're still doing that, Steve Sanderson flies to NDC Oslo and does this amazing presentation. There's a link to it on the next slide. I won't play it, but pull the slides and have a look, where he basically for an hour stands at his laptop and goes, wouldn't it be great if we could do this in the browser? Tap, tap, tap. There it is. And it is brilliant, just the kinds of stuff that he manages to do in the 2 or 3 short demos that he has. And this is with, you know, not even alpha versions of software, because we haven't had the 1.0 release of Blazor yet. It's on the way. .NET Anywhere gets abandoned, a public preview is announced. You can ignore the bits where I talk about me, but just as the public preview was announced, I ran a hackathon at work just playing with Blazor where I used to work. And these are the best bits, ASP.NET community stand-ups. Does anybody here watch those? There? No? Okay, cool, just me. Okay, so these are roughly every 2 weeks. 3 or 4 of the important people to do with ASP.NET get together, sit around a table and do a stand-up while they sit down. And they'll discuss what's coming up in the .NET community. They'll get someone in to talk about SignalR or Blazor or just about HTTP client, just to give you an idea, a sort of flavor of what's happening in .NET. Definitely worth checking those out. Those are available at live.asp.net. But yeah, on April 3rd they had one showing off the public preview. A couple of weeks later, I interviewed Ed Charbonneau of Progress Telerik about Blazor and stole all of the stuff that he said. And then towards the end of 2018, you had an entire episode, or an entire 2.5 hour block just showing off Blazor, which was amazing. And I'll come on to why that's amazing in a minute. And then, yeah, another one in February 2019. Just to give you some kind of idea of just how quickly we've gone from no Blazor to lots of Blazor. So yeah, the full version of the talk is essentially the first 12 years of the web being a thing. Nobody could decide on what JavaScript was and what CSS was. So the fact that we've gone from no Blazor to full Blazor in about 4 years is amazing to me. If you haven't seen this talk, definitely pull these slides and head over to that URL. Because it's legendary, just to show that .NET, even just to show that .NET could be loaded into the browser. So that's the boring history stuff, but how does Blazor work, right? So when your Blazor app loads, it is a HTML file. The HTML file loads a tiny bit of JavaScript, which loads a file called mono.wasm. WASM is one of the file formats for WebAssembly. This is Mono, that .NET runtime that's designed specifically to run on Unix systems and Unix likes. That loads into the browser, which then kicks off WebAssembly, which then loads the Mono runtime in WebAssembly. So before you've done anything, you've got .NET inside your browser. And then the Mono runtime gets given your entry point DLL, and much like how .NET Core and Mono on the desktop run, when you load a DLL or an exe, the first thing that happens is the runtime looks in the folder where the DLL was found for all of the DLLs that it requires. And if you're familiar with the GAC, the Global Assembly Cache, it looks there, then it looks outer until it gets to the root of your drive, then looks in a common place where it can find all those DLLs. That's why if you have system.random version 4 in the folder with your app, but version 5, I'm pulling numbers out of the thin air here. If you have a different version in different places, you have to do an assembly binding redirect to make sure you get the right version out. But then once that happens, it downloads all the DLLs, which is a lot of data, downloads all the DLLs, and then your app starts. And Blazor starts doing its thing and starts figuring out what you want to do. It then creates a virtual DOM in the same way that React and Angular do, inside of memory space in the browser. And then it represents what you want. So this is your C#, your CSHTML, your Razor, all that kind of stuff in that virtual DOM, sitting there ready to be used. And when you interact with the browser, actually what happens is your actions are mirrored onto that virtual DOM. All the processing is done there, and then the output is sort of put onto your screen into the real DOM, as it were. But obviously I said it downloads a whole bunch of .NET DLLs. That's a load of stuff, right? And yes, it is. I don't know whether you can see it there, it's quite small, but around here it says 16.4 megabytes were transferred, and it took 40 seconds to do so, which is huge. And yeah, I did talk about how you end up with hundreds of megabytes of JavaScript. Well, now you've got, you know, a couple hundred kilobytes of JavaScript and then 16 megabytes of DLLs, right? Except no, you do, but you don't. So this screenshot was taken from one of the first usable demos for Blazor, which was Blazor Who Is, which does a whole bunch of stuff with XML and JSON. So it pulls down system.xml and newtonsoft.json. And I don't know whether you've ever looked at the size of newtonsoft.json's main DLL. It's 12 megabytes, which is why this is huge. And the demo was created before the .NET Core 2.1 preview. So .NET Core 2.1 has this wonderful feature called IL shaking. So what that does, I've got an image on the next slide, it looks at all of the DLLs you're pulling in and goes, you're not using any of these APIs, so at runtime I'll recompile it and get rid of all of those DLLs, all of those APIs. And you could do it at build time as well. So for things like this, it's brilliant because you've got the 16 megabyte JavaScript file and you're only you're only using 2 APIs, so I'll get rid of everything for you. Also, obviously, don't include 15 megabytes of NuGet packages. So that's essentially what IL shaking is. There's a similar thing for Angular and React and Vue. This isn't a new thing. This is quite stable idea. But yeah, as you can see, we've got, I'll use the mouse pointer because then the folks over there can see. If you pull in newtonsoft.json, but you're not using whatever that was, I think JSON reader and any of these methods, then they get compiled out, get completely removed. But if you're only using deserialize object of type T, that and all of the APIs it requires will be included and nothing else, which is brilliant. It's really, really clever. Well, I suppose it isn't really clever, but it's really, really, really good. And yeah, it looks at all of these DLLs, and it can also re-JIT your DLL. So the JIT is the just-in-time debugger. So your code is converted into IL, intermediary language, wrapped into a DLL and sent over to the client, be that on the desktop in the browser. And the jitter comes along and runs that DLL, and just in time, which is where JIT comes from, just in time converts that to the bytecode for the system you're running on. Now, what .NET Core 2.1 and above can do is it can re-JIT those DLLs whilst it's running and apply more sort of aggressive optimizations for them, which is fantastic. So that makes it even better. And because it's happening inside the browser cache, then the next time your browser hits the website, it's got all of these DLLs in the cache, but it's also got, it's not just got those DLLs, it's got the more optimized versions of those DLLs. So you've already got better code than what's on the server, which is amazing. So what about .NET Core 3, right? That's right around the corner. They announced the release date for it yesterday, and I got really upset because they're changing the name of .NET Core to .NET, which means I'm going to have to rebrand the podcast, right? So yeah, .NET Core 3.0. Do you even need newtonsoft.json? Well, yes and no. They now have this specific API just for JSON stuff you can include. This isn't really Blazor stuff, but I think is pretty cool. So they've got this one API you can pull in JSON document that is specifically just for doing JSON stuff, but it's for doing very light, small JSON stuff. So you don't have to include newtonsoft.json with all of its hundreds of megabytes of, well, okay, tens of megabytes of DLLs. But yeah, it's just for parsing from JSON, not serializing to, or deserializing to, whichever way it is, reading JSON into memory, but not writing memory back out as JSON. So yeah, there's already documentation on how to do this, and in the slide notes, if I can figure out which way around these screens go, there's even a link here to a discussion on GitHub which led to how it was created. But that's the boring bit, right? That's the, you're not actually telling me about Blazor. So how does it all work? I need to rename this actually, because they keep flip-flopping on the name on the name for Blazor. It was originally Blazor, then it became Razor Components, now it's back to Blazor. Who can say what it's going to be called next week? But essentially it's this idea of HTML components that aren't really HTML, in the same way that you can have in Angular and React and Vue. I keep bringing these up because it's designed to be very similar. In Angular, React and Vue, you have these blocks of HTML that are encoded into JavaScript and then shipped to the browser and swapped out at runtime. Similar thing, except it's CS/HTML. So you've got your CS, I'll show you an actual demo in a moment, but you've got actual CS/HTML files, these Razor files, similar to Razor pages if you've used those. They get pulled down to the browser, and then you use inline functions and properties and stuff like that to pass things back and forth. So hopefully you can read the code snippet down the bottom. If not, I'll bring it up in a slightly bigger, that might help, I don't know, does that help? Yeah. So imagine in one file you've got this child component here, and you've got this child component here, which is a div with some styles on it, and it uses this @title. I'll take that highlighting off actually, that's no good. So it has this @title, this sort of Razor syntax stuff. We have a functions block inside of the CS/HTML. We mark a parameter with the parameter attribute, and we can reference it here, but we're also passing it in as part of the component on screen. So I'll just do all of that again with the mouse pointer, because I realize the folks over there looking at that screen can't see it. So yeah, we've got this div here, which is just some CS/HTML. We've got some C# inside the CS/HTML, which references that there in the same way that you would in Razor stuff. And you're passing in a value here, which isn't really an HTML attribute, but it is intercepted by the Blazor runtime to give you that HTML attribute and to give you the value of it. So are components Razor? Well, yes they are, and no they're not. I do have a massive text file with an answer. So essentially I brought up the ASP.NET Live stand-ups because during the big Blazor show, I asked the question. What's great about those shows is you can ask a question live and they will answer you as soon as someone notices there's a question. So I asked, are these Razor components the same as Razor pages? Is it the same as Razor syntax? And if you click that link, it'll take you through to 22 minutes and 47 seconds where I think it was Dan Roth answered my question. There's a huge answer. It goes on for about a minute and a half, but essentially it's not the same because it uses this virtual DOM to render everything, whereas CS/HTML doesn't work like that. So yeah, and then rendering it all. There's all sorts of stuff that goes into this. This is the really boring bit. I will show you a demo in a moment. So what about rendering? So you've got this virtual DOM inside your browser, and you're loading these components in, right? So it's client side, except it's not. It's also server side as well. So you can have there's two rendering options. You've got two models for rendering. I'll show you a really well put together, very well designed, very expensive to make image in a moment that shows this off. But you can have client side rendering where everything is downloaded into the client and the client does everything. It doesn't need to be connected to the internet anymore unless it's talking to external endpoints. And the server side where you have a client and a server. The server sets up a signaler connection and passes stuff backwards and forwards. So as you can see, I've spent loads of money and loads of time designing this slide. So client-side rendering, like I said, the server has all of the files, sends it down to the client loads those and does what it needs with them. It can then talk back to the server if it wants or to a third-party endpoint, but essentially it has all of the code it needs to be able to do Blazor stuff. The server-side rendering is a little bit more complex, and I haven't really been able to come up with a good reason for using it yet, but I think it's more a case of that they've created this idea and put it out there to see what people will do with it. So the server-side rendering is your server downloads some HTML and JavaScript to the browser. Browser bootstraps all of the stuff we talked about earlier on, the Blazor stuff, and then creates a signal or connection back to the server. Every time you click a button, it sends a message back to the server and says, users click this button. The server then does all of the rendering and all of that kind of stuff quick fast, and then sends the individual DOM elements that need to be changed to represent the change that is brought about by clicking the button, if that makes sense. So if I have an order pizza button or add to basket button, I click the add to basket, the message goes off to the server adds it to the basket on the server, and then passes back, right, so you need to change this button to now be removed from basket and put a little icon on the basket in the top right hand corner, that kind of thing. So you've got options is what I'm trying to get at. So what I'm going to talk you through is really quick. I'm going to talk you through an app that I threw together called Blazor. It uses the Pokemon API. I'm not a huge fan of Pokemon, but my brother is, so I did this just specifically so I could show him, and hopefully this will work because I'm connected to my phone to do this, so we'll see. So Blazor, if I do, how do I get the developer console? There we go. So if I go JavaScript console and I go network and I clear my cache and then I refresh and sit and wait, you can see it's struggling already because I'm connected to my phone, which is connected to the web. But you can see already it's pulled down 2, 3, 4, coming up on 3 megabytes of stuff. It's taking a while because I'm about 5 megabytes of stuff. I don't have the world's best connection, but you can see it's pulled down lots and lots, and you can actually see the DLLs. So that, I don't know whether you can see it there, but that what I've clicked there says microsoft.asp.netcore.blazor.dll. Now the browser can't preview it because it's a DLL, it's a binary file, and it's being compressed by the code that I'm running on the server, but it's pulling down the actual DLLs for my application. So you can see I've clicked on there that says pokeblazer.client.dll, which is the entry point for my application. It's pulled down mono.wasm. It's pulled down a shared library. I'll go into that in a minute. But if I go over here and I type in 213 and I hit search, it goes and does an HTTP request to the Pokemon API and gets some data back on this here Pokemon. So I'm just going to close this to make it easier to see. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because Blazor can do anything JavaScript can do, because Blazor can do what WebAssembly can do. WebAssembly can only do what JavaScript can do, but it can do really cool things like, and I hope this works, that. I don't know whether you saw, but I've got a mouse on hover, so I can set up things to change as I hover, which is really cool. And I can do, if I do this one, we've got another on hover there, so it's changing color as I hover because there's these shinies. I don't get Pokemon, my brother does, and that makes him happy. That's all that matters. But yes, so that's that essentially. But what is, oh, yep, sorry.
The DLLs that get downloaded, are they exactly the same ones as that come from the NuGet package?
Yep, they are, yeah. So if I...
Then turns that into WebAssembly in the browser?
It does, yeah. So the DLLs are downloaded into the browser, into that so the DLLs aren't converted to WebAssembly. The WebAssembly is essentially like your operating system on your computer, and then it boots a mono WebAssembly environment, which is like running .NET Framework on your computer, and then you throw a DLL at it, and it acts the same way that .NET Framework or .NET Core would on your machine, or Mono if you run Mono on your machine. So it provides that sort of runtime for your app to run.
Possible to pre-compile things with WebAssembly?
It totally is, yeah. There's with the .NET Core 3 tooling that is meant to be coming out for the next preview, you can do ahead of time compilation down to WebAssembly. So then instead of pulling the DLLs, setting up a WebAssembly and then loading it in, you're pulling down the WebAssembly and your WebAssembly environment's already set up, so you can speed that up no end. I mean, this code was initially written when the 0.3 preview came out, and we're inching towards 1.0. I think the last time I looked into it was 0.8, so I can't actually remember when I built it. But yeah, But yeah, essentially, yeah. If I go back to this this one, I don't know. I don't usually use Safari, you see. So there we go. So yeah, I can't remember how to zoom on a Mac, but there you go. But yeah, each of these DLLs can at runtime, at build time. Oh, where they gone? I don't want to refresh because I'll lose it all. But each of the DLLs can at build time be transpiled into WebAssembly. You can even use, there's open source tools already to transpile to WebAssembly, so you can use those. You can literally, pointing at the DLLs, tell it it's a .NET DLL, and it will do it all for you, which is brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks. So one of the points that was raised just then by one of the gents in the group was, is it just divs and stuff like that? Because I realised I didn't really go into how the app is built up. So I remember I showed you Pokemon, the Pokédex thing. Well, I'll show you the actual code because this could be quite useful as long as I'm looking at the right file. Nope. Well done, Jamie. Not even looking at the right file. So let's open the right file then. Open. I really like Visual Studio Code. Absolutely love it. So let's open that. Although I do have, there it is. Although I do have Rider installed, I absolutely love Visual Studio Code. So, in a typical Blazor app, you can see I've already, hopefully you can see on that screen, I've already added Docker stuff to it, and that all works. You can use, you don't even have to have the tools installed. You can use Docker to build it, and then output the binaries and serve it that way. It's brilliant. But in a typical Blazor app, you're going to have a client, which is this project here, and a server. Client and server are misnomers because they both happen inside the browser. But essentially the server is your bootstrap point, your main entry point. And for those of you who've done a lot of ASP.NET Core, the startup file is pretty similar. I just scroll around a little bit. Maybe if I do this and then make the text bigger. I like to have small text when I'm developing, but I don't know how that's appearing on screen. That looks pretty good, doesn't it? So you have this sort of configure services, and I'm telling it specifically compress all the things that are octet streams or WebAssembly stuff, and then down here I've got app.useBlazor client.program. So this essentially says when the app starts, essentially, it sounds really silly me saying it, go and call the useBlazor stuff and pass in this client.program. So client.program exists in, no, okay, so if I go over here, that's in my client code base, and it says go and run this program.cs. Now this is an old design. The newer Blazor apps don't use the same sort of save state, but as you can see, when the app starts, I add a singleton of PokeState, and then I go and tell the browser, go and render with my service provider, find a component called main, and embed that into, any HTML that gets rendered in the app tag. So I'll take a look at PokeState and then I'll come back to that add component. So my PokeState, which I believe is in my shared, is it in shared? No, it's not. I can't remember where I put it now. Oh, it's in services. Okay. So this is, like I say, this is an old design. This isn't accepted new practice. But essentially, when that page loads, so I'll show you the browser again. When this page initially loads, I don't want to refresh it. Yeah, let's refresh it. What's the worst that could happen? When this page initially loads, it loads this loading div that you saw that says paging Dr. Oak or whatever, Professor Oak. And it does that until all of the data is loaded into the browser. And then a state change happens. It's similar to, has anyone done web forms? No? Okay, I am going back quite a far way back there with web forms. We're talking classic ASP, just after classic ASP, where you would have a post back. So you would do something on your browser and then you'd have to send it back to the server to be re-rendered to come back. That's similar to what's happening here, except all of that state is being held in the browser. So now that we've gone out of the loading state, we're now into like a ready state. And then if I type something into here, like I do a search for Cubone again, and I hit search, what will happen is it will go into a searching state. So there's this global object that keeps the state of what the app is doing and hides and shows different divs based on what's happening. So whilst it's searching, it shows this searching, and then when it's searched, well, the search results have come back, it shows you the div with all of the stuff in it. Don't know why I've got a shadow there, but there you go. And that is essentially, that's the wrong one, keep doing this. So that's essentially what this global object is doing. So I have a Pokemon object, which is my search result. I've got a bool to say whether the search is in progress or not, and whether the user has supplied a valid ID. It's a really stupid check to see whether the ID is valid, because the Pokemon API doesn't allow you to search by name, just by ID. But by that point, if you already know the ID, you know what Pokemon it is. But you can only use the API I have access to. So the onChange event is literally a little action that fires to tell Blazor, hey, something's changed, go re-render the DOM. And then I'm using a HTTP client and a HTTP instance to then be able to, so when I hit that search button, we enter this method, we set search in progress to true, we tell Blazor something has changed, we then try and validate it, and if I can, nope, I bet if I F12 it's going to do, nope, I don't know what it's going to do, but I've got that in here somewhere. Helpers, I guess. Yeah, Pokemon ID validator. It's a really simple check. I like to put lots of documentation into my code, but essentially it takes in a string, because I'll show you in a minute, the view component has a string property, and we have a maximum value that I'm hard coding, but it is set by the API, and literally, is it null or white space? Can I parse it? If it's greater than 0 and it's less than or equal to the maximum value, it validated. It's not the best validation code in the world, but it works for this in this instant, in this thing. So I validate it, and then go and say, if the supplied ID is valid, go and literally do a AJAX and JSON async get to this. So this is happening in the browser, right? So this, particularly this line of code here, will be converted into an XHR, an XHR get, and sent off to wherever, to this endpoint, and then when it comes back, it will use deserialize of type T to get me from JSON into my Pokemon object and store it in here. But then if we haven't got a valid one, it will set search result to null. There's a really bad check happening in the view I'll show you in a minute that just says if the search result is null, we obviously don't have a search result. Once we've finished searching, we then tell Blazor, hey, something has changed again, and that literally is just this function here, onChange.evoke. So if onChange is valid, if it's not null, we call an invoke method on it. Blazor is already hooked into this, so anytime I want to change something on screen, I'll do the code that needs to change, and then I'll say, Blazor, something's changed, go figure it out. And Blazor will look through that DOM tree, that render tree, and figure out, oh right, you've set this bool, which means I need to show that div. And I'll show you all of that in a moment, but that's basically how that works. And this is all in my client code, which again, it's a misnomer because both the client and the server are inside the client. But what's great about this, excuse me, is I have this shared library. I don't need TypeScript or JavaScript anymore. So my Pokemon object looks like this, which is the information that comes back from the Pokemon API, but in a C# object. If I had multiple views or multiple parts of my app, or maybe even something on the server, on an actual server, not the server inside the browser, but the actual origin server that needed to use this object, I could just throw that DLL at it. I can use the same DLL for my view models in the browser and on the server, which is amazing, in my opinion anyway. But anyway, let's have a look at this view then. So, in my main.cshtml, so if let me dial back a little bit. So if you remember here, we said, go call the browser render, pass in my service provider, which is the thing that's providing my Pokemon state, add a component called main, add a component of type main to something called app, right? Whole bunch of stuff happening there, but essentially that says, go into my main.cshtml and add that to the layout file. So those of you who've done Razor or Razor Pages, MVC, all that kind of stuff, may be familiar with view imports and layout files, and that's essentially what this is doing. So this is allowing me to add all of these things into every view. So that's nice. Oops. Get rid of that bar there. I'll just get rid of all of these windows so I don't get lost. And yeah, so it finds this main component and allows me to start doing stuff. And as you can see, without this stuff at the bottom, if I just literally delete that now, it's I mean, you can't really see on that screen because it's a bit too bright, but that's not a problem. You've literally got just divs. It is just literally divs, and these things, grey out zone and Pokemon result and Pokemon search, which aren't really HTML tags, but Blazor knows at runtime, hey, random Pokemon search isn't an HTML tag, so I'd better look for a component that is called random Pokemon search, which I will go to now. So I'll go to components, random Pokemon search, which is just literally, I'll zoom out slightly so you can see a little bit more of it. It's using semantic UI, and it's just a bunch of divs with controls on it, standard normal controls. And you can see here I'm already binding some stuff. So I've got a row here where we take a Pokemon ID. I've got an input of type text, and I'm binding it to this value called Pokemon ID, which is in my functions. I've marked it as a parameter, telling Blazor something is going to use this value, or potentially I could pass it into this component, which is quite good, because so when you first draw this, you can pass in a value which represents like your default. So you can pass in a 0 or 1 or 2 or 37 or the word Jeff or whatever. And because Blazor in WebAssembly just wraps around what JavaScript can do, I've got an onClick method, which Blazor then interprets because I'm passing in a C# method here, an action that points to the method onGetPokemon, which is down here. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then just passes in that Pokemon API that we're supplying in here. So this method here, it knows to bind to the, I believe it's the Pokestate. So it knows that, so Blazor knows when it runs that all I've done in this random Pokemon search, all I've done here is declared it. I haven't provided an actual, I have not provided a definition. So what it'll do is it'll look everywhere it can in the source code to find that before it runs it. So it knows to then call this, so it's the same method. This onGetPokemon is the actual task it will run. So when I push that button, that search button, it will call this method. And it will do things with my global state. So it will set a Pokemon, it will tell me whether its search is in progress, and it'll tell me whether the supplied ID is valid. I'm defaulting to true there because I like to trust the user, which is my fault. So that's the search. So that gets inserted when there is no, so if I go back to that main file again, you can see here, search area, random Pokemon result, onGetPokemon. So I talked about that before, I'm passing it in, onGetPokemon, which is in my Pokemon search result here, this parameter. I'm passing in the value and saying, go to the Pokemon state, which is this thing here, and call getPokemon with it. So that's how it knows to sort of reverse look it up. Excuse me. And then I have this sort of grey out, I'll call it a grey out zone, which just is the search function, that search box that spins with paging Dr. Oak. And that has a parameter, where are we? Grey out zone. It's got a parameter called searching, which I'm passing in the value of search in progress, which is a bool. So in my grey out zone, I've got if searching, add these to the view. Otherwise, look for any child components that hang off of this one. So this grey out zone is a child component of main. And I could, if I want, have a child component of grey out zone. And if you look back on the main there, I've got that. So I've got grey out zone, and it has a child component of random Pokemon result. So if a search is not in progress, it will render whatever this gives it. Otherwise, if a search is in progress, if I go back to it, if a search is in progress, then it will show us that little div with the loading spinner, just collapse this, with this little loading spinner that just says paging Professor Oak, just because I wanted to display something whilst it was being rendered. So because I'm passing in a child component, I need to capture it as a render fragment, and because I've got this thing, I can directly reference it here in this else. And this is the thing I'm passing in. I'm passing in another component, and you can do this. You can go components all the way down as far as you want. And in this random Pokemon search result, I'm passing in the Pokemon to display and whether it is valid or not. So if I go back over here, random Pokemon result, and this will show you that there are components all the way down. So this is already, we've got main, grey out zone, random Pokemon search result. So if you've got a valid search ID, then if we don't have a valid search ID, I only want to display this. Whereas if we've got a Pokemon to display, I want to start displaying some divs. and then for each of the types it has, and then another child component. So we've now got main, grey out zone, Pokemon result, images. And then alongside that we've got abilities and Pokemon stats. So this is showing that you can have this hierarchy of multiple different components that you can add in. Similar to like you can with Vue and Angular and React, that sort of single page application idea. And again, I'm passing in some parameters here that if we have a look here, we've got some parameters down at the bottom. And if I go back to my main file, I'm passing those in here. The value of Pokemon to display here is mapped to whatever that value is, which is the result that comes back from the real server, the API, which is then, if I go to the random Pokemon result, it's then put there, and it is used throughout this file. So if I double click that, Visual Studio Code is quite nice in that it will highlight where it's being used, and you can see it's used in a whole bunch of places. If I don't supply that, if I supply that as null, then this whole if block will not get it, well, it will get evaluated, but nothing will be added into the DOM there. And that's where Blazor comes in. It's able to do this quick, constant swapping out of rendered objects into and out of your CS HTML. Because this is an old demo, it doesn't have the CSS stuff. So now, I think from Blazor version 6 onwards, you can now inject CSS values in as well. So you can pass in the same way that we're passing in a parameter here. I could pass in different theming options. So if I want the div to display red when there's an error, I can pass in color equals red, and the div inside of that component will be styled as red. Or if I want to pass in all the text needs to be bold, or if I want to say, whilst you are displaying this div, get this CSS file and add that to the global CSS that's being used in the DOM, it will do that for me, and it will do it completely at runtime, which is pretty mad, if I'm honest. All of this code here is all on GitHub, and I'll share links afterwards so you can pull this and start playing with it if you want. There is a Docker file for it, so you don't even have to pull that. There's a URL as well, so the version of it that I pulled up in my browser, I don't know whether you can see it, but it's pokeblazer.azurewebsites.net. I'll send around links and stuff, but it is on the free Azure tier, so if you hit it after maybe an hour, it'll take a couple of seconds to respond. I'll leave that for anyone who wants to take a photograph. But yeah, so that's kind of how the whole thing is sort of glued together. There's a lot of moving parts, but they're simple enough that they're similar to like React and Angular. So if I go back to here, so as we can see from that, Blazor is really good at single page applications. If you have a bunch of data that is exposed in an API and you just want to display that somewhere, that's brilliant. Blazor is really good at this because it allows you to sort of rapidly develop anything that you want, that sort of view that you want. I hate that I've written this, but it is totally rad and epically agile. It is all about just sort of quickly throwing something together, because I'm going to guess the majority of us are .NET developers, so we don't particularly like to be playing with hundreds of megabytes. What was it? I was looking into. I actually had some troubles earlier on this week running an npm install on my own computer, and I tweeted all about it, all the steps I had to take to get npm to actually work on a brand new Dell Windows 10 machine. And I was doing. It was for a Netlify CMS. I'm looking into all these different technologies. The npm installed Netlify CMS, and all hell broke loose. And I shouldn't have to do that. But with Blazor, I don't have to do that. I could just go file new Blazor app, done. Or .NET space new space Blazor, done. So it's all about that sort of rapid prototyping. And as we all know, prototypes are never prototypes. They end up being the real software. So why not have something that's pretty good sat behind it, rather than the entirety of the node ecosystem that can fall over when someone refuses to check something in. I have put blogging engine, but I am working on a CMS system with Blazor because it works really well with Markdown. I did have another demo, but I've taken that out, where I'm pulling Markdown from an API and displaying that and rendering it as if it's HTML, because I'm using there's a NuGet package that it pulls in, so you can pull in whatever works with .NET Standard, so .NET Framework, .NET Core, Mono, any of those NuGet packages work with Blazor. So there's things that it can't do, like TCP packets and drawing pixels and stuff like that. It falls over a little bit. There is also, so this one is really cool, created by Mr. Magoo. It is essentially, if it's going to load, hopefully it'll load. It's loading through my phone. But this is essentially Blazor Tetris when it loads. Again, it's loading on my phone, so it's going to take a little while. And hopefully I'll have enough battery power to get on the train when I go home. But, so this is loading probably hundreds of megabytes of DLLs, but it's, when it loads, it is Tetris in the browser entirely in .NET, which I think is pretty cool. So that's worth checking out. That's at SQL-Mr. Magoo. Again, pull the slides and you'll be able to find it. The biggest problem, and it still is a problem now with Blazor, is when you have exceptions, when you're debugging stuff. If you're debugging locally and you have Visual Studio installed, you can put a breakpoint in your CS/HTML, and when you hit that breakpoint, it'll break in the browser and it'll break in your Visual Studio, and you can inspect stuff. I run a Mac. I don't have Visual Studio for Mac, but if I did have it, I would be able to do that. Rider doesn't fully support it, so if you're using JetBrains' IDE, it doesn't fully support everything that Blazor can do. It gets confused and it tells you your code's wrong. It fails a compilation, then it passes a compilation because it doesn't know what, in my instance, what a grey out zone is. It's telling me that's not a valid HTML element. But the biggest problem is exceptions. If you have an exception that happens in your .NET code which is running in, so if your .NET code throws an exception, Mono will catch it, wrap it, and throw it down to JavaScript, which will catch it and wrap it and throw it down to the browser. So you've got 500,000 different messages that you've got to sort of peel your way back through to get to a point where you realize, oh right, that was null. You know, it's a C# null ref. So it can get a bit difficult to manage. And then on top of that, your app keeps running. It's because it's in JavaScript, because when JavaScript hits an error, it can keep running. And they've made the Mono WebAssembly so that it'll keep running regardless. So it'll keep trying and keep trying. You'll get hundreds of these instances of these null refs, which is a bit of a problem. So this is, I'm going to attempt a demo now, and we'll see what happens. I found this out a few months back, that you can run Blazor without a server. So I'm going to attempt to statically host Blazor on Netlify, where there is no server-side technology, and see what happens. I checked this morning at 4 AM and it worked. Whether the demo gods are with me today, I don't know. And I'm also running on my phone. So what I'm going to be doing, it's going to be a bit of a boring one, but I have a HTML file here, and I'll do inspect element, and you can see it is literally just HTML. It is just literally no Blazor here. There's nothing going on in this file. It's just an H1 with no Blazor here, right? But I also have, if I can get to my Visual Studio Code over here, I have a static Blazor demo, which has stopped moving. No, I'm dragging it the wrong way. It's not going to let me move it. That's a shame. I do have, yes, no, because this is full screen. So take that out of there. See if I can drag this across now. There we go. So I have a static Blazor demo, which is just literally what happens when you bring up the terminal and it opens over here, because of course it does. We bring this over here and do new tab, and you go CD back out of there, CD back out of there into code, and do .NET new Blazor name dotnetsheff. When you do that, the .NET CLI will wrap a whole bunch of code. Oh, brilliant. I am doing really well. Okay, so what's happened here is I really like the CLI. I'm not very good at Git, but I really like the CLI, and I think I've explained it to a few people today so far. The reason I like the CLI is because it does its job and then gets out of the way. Visual Studio, not so much. Visual Studio doesn't do that. It stays there and keeps in your way. But what's happened here, if I do an ls, I've created a folder called dotnetsheff, and I change it to dotnetsheff and do an ls. I've essentially got the contents of this folder here this source folder in there. So all I've done is .NET New, Blazor, and given it a name. So that's all I've done there. And you can see in this dist directory, it's that same H1. So what I'm going to do, did I do it already? Did I do it already? No, I didn't. Brilliant. So this is going to either go really well or horrendously bad. We'll soon find out. I have that much confidence in myself. So if I go back out to my code, do an ls, I go into static Blazor demo. Right, so I go into source. So one of the things with the .NET tooling that I really like is I can do .NET publish. I don't even have to be inside of any kind of IDE. When I started learning C# back in 2004, the lecturer that I had at uni lived in the CLI. So I'm more comfortable compiling with the CLI than I am with Visual Studio. I've got a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Visual Studio, but that's my... So then if I do this, so what this is going to do, I don't know whether you can see that, hopefully you can read that. It says .NET publish -c release -o ../dist. That means do a publish in a release configuration and output it to the folder above this one called dist. Right? And in the Visual Studio Code editor, you should be able to see that dist folder. No, it'll create a new dist folder, which means I've probably done it wrong. But you can see here it's doing, so I don't know whether you can see, so it's done a whole bunch of tree shaking here. Remember I talked about that earlier on? So we've got save that assembly there, save that assembly there, and then there's a few deletes. Don't need that assembly because I'm not using it, don't need that assembly because I'm not using it, don't need that assembly because I'm not using it. So it's deleting stuff as it goes along. So if I go into here, yeah, it has, okay, that's a shame. It's dragged this to the wrong place, but it has eventually produced a dist directory with an index file that just says go get _framework Blazor WebAssembly.js. So _framework Blazor WebAssembly.js. This is probably going to crash. Oh, yep, I thought it was going to crash, but essentially that is a minified version of the WebAssembly stuff required to bootstrap, the Blazor stuff required to bootstrap WebAssembly. I wouldn't recommend you try and read it unless you're really good at JavaScript. I'm not, so I'm not going to read it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag those 3 files out to here. Yep, I'm going to overwrite those files. I'm going to replace those files. I'm going to get rid of that source directory. So we now should have dist with an index which has changed. I'm going to get rid of the web config because we don't need that. So essentially, I am going to push up to Netlify that directory. And if it works, which I hope it will, what I should be doing is I should be pushing it as we speak. But if it works, what's going to happen is, I've got a whole bunch of files there, stage, added static version of Blazor app. I'm doing it to the dotnetsheff thing there, push that up, that's going to take a while. I'm going to go back to Netlify and make sure that I'm using the right branch, because if I'm not, this will be incredibly boring. So it's been published, and I just need to go to build and deploy and make sure it's using the right thing. Oh, it's using master, so let's change this to .netsheff. So for those of you who haven't used Netlify before, it is amazing. It allows you to build and host static sites for free. It does all of the server-side stuff. If you're doing JavaScripty things, I know I mentioned JavaScript earlier on and my hatred for it, but if you're doing JavaScript things, Hugo, Hexo, all those kinds of sort of single-page, static page generators, you could point this at one of those like a repo with all of that in, and it will quite happily deploy a bunch of, deploy whatever you give it to, whatever you give it. So hopefully this will work. So what this is going to do is this is going to take the contents of the static Blazor demo. It's going to get the .netsheff. Yes, it worked. Fantastic. So let's just have a look at the deployment log. So this has gone and done a git clone on .netsheff on static Blazor demo, which is the thing I was just looking at. It's gone and pulled the .netsheff branch, gone and changed into dist and deployed that to here. So if I then refresh this page, this should hopefully take ages to load and then show you .NET running in the browser without having to use a server. It's going to take a while. It's already at 4 seconds. What's it going to do? I'm getting really antsy here. But the fact that there is a loading text there tells me that it is loading the WebAssembly stuff. It's only going slow now because I'm paired with my phone and I'm not paying a lot for data access. I think I'm getting a 3G speed at the minute, so it will take a while. But essentially what's happening here is it's then loading all of those. If I go back to the network, you can see it's loading. There we go. We've already got some DLLs. So if I click on that one, that is Microsoft ASP, Netcore, browser, Blazor browser.dll, and then it's, oh, there you go. That's why it's taking so long. MS Colib, essentially .NET itself, which was 600 kilobytes. Yeah. So that's the demo Blazor app being served from without a server, well, with a server, but without any kind of .NET server. So I'm not having to pay £7 a day or whatever to have a server that is running Windows, that has got a VM on it, that has IIS, that has the code to then serve all this stuff. This all works pretty flawlessly. That's all happening in the browser. I've got some data that it fetches from an API, all happening in the browser, all because of Blazor. I don't need a server anymore. This is almost serverless computing. I don't have any kind of code running on that server, which is fantastic. And then I think I can keep clicking this and it'll keep doing it. I think it gets random data every time. Ah, it broke. Okay, that's fine. But so the routing isn't working properly, but that's because I put the demo together at 4 o'clock this morning before I'd had breakfast. But that's just showing that. And look, when I refreshed, remember I said about it being lots and lots of data, it takes a couple of seconds, but because all of those DLLs here, all of these DLLs which are loaded over HXR requests are all in memory, all I've got to do is re-render the page. It's not having to re-download all of this data, which means that if you have a site that people hit a lot and they're not going to be clearing their caches, and it doesn't have to be super complex, you can load it all into their browser, which is what a PWA does, and have that all there, right? I'm well impressed that worked. I totally did not expect that to work. So if I go back to here, we can see how this works. So program CS is your main entry point. So this is this is Blazor 0.8. I'll go through this real quick. It's quite different to Blazor as I used it. So we're using Blazor startup. It calls the startup method, and in here we're calling add component of type app to an area that you can see called app. So we have a component in here in the source directory. Where is it? It's in pages. Nope, it's not. It's in shared. It's in here somewhere. I don't know. Main layout. Yeah. So this is the layout of the main layout, and this is all. If you do a .NET new Blazor, you will get this. It has a nav menu, and it's got whether it's collapsed or not, all happening in C#. And then where are we? Let's do fetch data. So fetch data is an interesting one. It talks back to the server that is running in the browser. So there's this divide, isn't there, of the client and server both running in the browser. The client is what you're interacting with inside the browser, and the browser is talking to itself because it sets up an HTTP client in the browser, which says, go and get me this file from the Netlify server, and once you've done that, go and do your JSON async and then display it on screen. Really impressed that worked. You might not be impressed, but I'm impressed. And then, so there's this is all happening in C# as well. So each time I push that button, it takes this current count and increments it. I could do multiply by 2, republish, and then it would multiply it by 2. But if I did that and republished it, I would then have to wait the 16, 17, 18 seconds for it to download again, because one of the DLLs has changed. So all of those DLLs have to be re-downloaded. Bit of a shame, really. Where is my thing? So yeah, you can even host it on a static, as a static website, which makes it even cheaper to run. Which, I mean, I'm doing that for free. I think I've got 6 or 7 sites on my Netlify account, 2 of which are production sites that people hit on a daily basis. It costs me nothing to host them. So you could totally do something with Blazor. That's pretty much the end of it. I've got a whole bunch of sources on this on this slide. I should have updated this one actually, because one of the demos I didn't do was with the headless Umbraco, system. So Umbraco is a .NET CMS, and they have a headless option, so you can just have a CMS in the cloud, and it exposes some JavaScript APIs. They have a .NET client, and I threw that, which is .NET Framework, threw that into Blazor, and it just worked. I'd recommend taking a look through Blazor.net and learn Blazor.net. They're two separate things. One is the official Microsoft documentation, Blazor.net, and the other one is, I think it's some random company in America that's created a whole bunch of stuff to sort of teach people how to do Blazor. Blazor State Has Changed is a wonderful series of videos by Ed Charbonneau of Telerik, going through all the recent stuff as it happens. He was also on episode 5 of the podcast, and that's as far as I've got. There's a lot of stuff there, and most of it was really boring, and really I don't think the demos are really that interesting, but there you go. One question that I do sometimes get asked with this, that I've talked to a few people about, is just real quick. I was asked, what are the security implications of running a random DLL in the browser? And I said to this person, do you do NPM? Do you do JavaScript development? He says yes. So what's the security implications of running a random NPM package in your browser? Do you vet all the code? No. You look at some code on NuGet and you go, yeah, that'll be fine, and pull that in. It's the same thing. What I'm getting at is it's the same sort of thing, but with WebAssembly and Blazor, you can only do what JavaScript can do. So if JavaScript can touch the file system, then you can touch the file system. If JavaScript can set up connections to the outside world, then Blazor can set up connections to the outside world. So there's a few, in the same way that we do with all of our web development, there's a few caveats and a few things you have to really think about. Does this NuGet package I'm pulling in talk to the outer web? Does it talk to the file system? Does it talk to SD cards? That kind of thing. But yeah, if there are any questions, I'll try and answer them. No questions? Anybody awake? Oh, yep. Oh, that's a good point. Has the Tetris thing loaded? Yes, it has. Right, I can never get this to work properly on my machine. Because you're supposed to be able to look. You're supposed to be able to use left and right to be able to play it, but I can't. Maybe it never seems to work for me, which is a real shame. And I think it's because it's Safari. I think there's something in Safari that it doesn't like. But you're quite welcome to. I didn't create this, so. But you're quite welcome to try it out. That's sequel-mrmagoo.github.io/Bletris. I'll send out the slides. You can get it from there. It's more than likely because it's Safari that I'm doing it in. I don't have any other browsers installed, otherwise I would I'd try it. But yeah, you could totally try that. And it'll work on your phone as well. So the great thing about Blazor is it will run wherever WebAssembly runs. WebAssembly runs on all of the modern browsers and Edge. But it doesn't run in IE, but it will run on your phone. If you've got a relatively modern phone with a good enough internet connection, it will run on that too. It runs on the standard Android browser, and all the browsers on iOS just wrap around Safari anyway, so you can do it on your iPhone as well. So you could go to that web address and be playing Tetris on your phone using .NET, which is mad, I think. But there you go. Oh no, I lost. Oh well. But yeah, any other questions? Any other thoughts? No.
I was going to ask whether you can do things like timeouts and animation to play with that Tetris example.
Yeah, it's essentially anything you can do in JavaScript, you can do in WebAssembly. So yeah, you can do timeouts, you can do any kind of. You can even do JavaScript interrupt. So your .NET code is running in the browser, but you also can call JavaScript stuff. So if you've got jQuery UI, you can call that and do some kind of fancy animation on the screen, and then your .NET code will wait until it receives a response from jQuery UI, and then it will carry on. Or you can call some JavaScript that already exists on your page to do something like download a file or parse some kind of weird file format, and it will wait for the response, and then it will interpret the response. So you don't have to go Blazor or JavaScript, you can use both. So if you already have a JavaScript heavy website, you just want to add something to it with .NET, you can use Blazor to add something to it with .NET. So let's say you're doing image processing in the browser, you want to use .NET and you want it to happen really quickly, you can totally pull in Blazor, pull in image sharp or any of those libraries and just go JavaScript, call Blazor, do the thing with the image, and then get the resulting bitmap or whatever. So yeah, it's a really cool piece of kit. There hasn't been a killer app yet, so if you have any ideas, get working on them and get them hosted somewhere. Tell Microsoft about them, and they'll make a big load of noise about it. But yes. Any other questions, thoughts, anything like that? No? Okay, cool. But yes, so I am, like I say, I am Jamie. My Twitter handle is .NET_blog. If you want to find out about the podcast, definitely check that out. But you've all been absolutely wonderful and really quiet. So are you all there? Am I just making this up? I don't know. But yes, I do have loads of stickers in my bag. So if you are of a I want stickers on my laptop sort of person, come over and have a chat, and you can have a sticker if you want. You don't have to have a sticker. It's completely up to you. So there you go. Thank you.